There are certain roads that seem to stretch beyond time. Roads where no matter how long you've been driving, you feel like you've gone nowhere. That night, the 513 highway felt exactly like that. It was a narrow, mostly unlit country road that cut through fields and patches of woods, with only the occasional mailbox or flickering porch light to remind you people still lived out there. We were a group of four: Michael, Eddie, Daniela, and me. Just 20-somethings, tired from a night out, stuffed into my aging sedan, music blaring, the car heavy with the scent of sweat, beer, and fried food. I was the designated driver, the only one sober. And the only one, it turns out, who would remember that night clearly. We'd spent the evening at a house party in town, celebrating someone's birthday. Too loud, too crowded, the kind of night that becomes a blur of bad music and worse decisions. Around 1:30 a.m., I had gathered everyone and started the drive back. Daniela was in the passenger seat, Michael and Eddie in the back, still riding the high of cheap drinks and thumping bass lines. The road ahead was pitch black. I kept my eyes on the faded white lines and tried to ignore how the darkness outside the windshield seemed to press inward. Then Daniela started whining. "I have to pee," she mumbled, then repeated louder, more urgently. "I have to pee. Like, right now." I told her we were miles from anything. "You'll have to hold it," I said, but she started squirming in her seat, half laughing, half crying, in that drunken way where everything becomes dramatic. Eventually, I gave in. There was a wide shoulder coming up, with a break in the trees that led into what looked like an overgrown field. Probably crops. I slowed down and pulled over, putting on the hazard lights. Daniela flung the door open before I even stopped and stumbled into the tall brush on the right side of the road, disappearing without a word. "I'll go too," I said, suddenly aware of my own bladder. I didn't want to admit it, but the thought of squatting in the dark wasn't appealing. So I went to the opposite side of the road and walked a few feet into the tree-line for privacy. The air was still, not a single breeze, just the quiet of the country night. Crickets, distant frogs, the occasional whoosh of wind through the brush. I finished quickly and got back in the car. Eddie and Michael were still singing along to the music, half shouting lyrics, entirely unaware of how long Daniela had been gone. After about 5 minutes, I started to get uneasy. "She's still not back?" I asked. Michael shrugged, his head lolling against the seat. "Daniela," I shouted out the window. No response. Michael leaned out the back window and hollered her name, his voice echoing over the fields. Still nothing. That was when the pit formed in my stomach. That subtle, awful twist of dread that tells you something just crossed the line from weird to wrong. "Come with me," I said to Michael. He groaned but complied, lurching out of the car and slamming the door behind him. I grabbed the flashlight from the glove box. Thank God I kept one in there. And together we started walking into the crops in the direction Daniela had gone. The field was wild with overgrowth. The plants were tall, nearly up to my chest, and the ground was uneven. We pushed through the stalks, calling her name, the flashlight beam bobbing ahead of us. Michael was still half laughing. She probably passed out, or got lost. Watch her be peeing this whole time. But I wasn't laughing. I didn't like how quiet it was. Too quiet. We kept walking, the stalks scratching our arms, the flashlight beam catching glimpses of nothing. Then, over the sound of our steps and Michael snickering, I heard something else. A second set of footsteps. Not behind us. Beside us. I stopped and threw my arm in front of Michael's chest. "What?" he whispered, suddenly sober. I raised a finger to my lips. "Shoo." We listened. At first, nothing. Then, faintly, the crunch of movement, just beyond the stalks. Like someone was carefully walking in tandem with us, just out of view. "Daniela?" Michael called again. The sound stopped. No reply. My heartbeat was pounding in my ears now. The flashlight trembled in my hand. "Let's go," I whispered. We turned to head back, but just ahead of us the crops thinned slightly. A narrow clearing, no wider than 2 people standing side by side. It looked almost like a path, intentionally cut. I shined the light down it. Nothing. Swung it the other way. And that's when I saw him. At the very edge of the light's reach, someone stepped into the clearing. Just stood there. The beam hit the lower half of his body first. Jeans, boots, legs covered in dirt, and something darker. Then I tilted the light up and caught his face. He was pale, expressionless, eyes wide and unblinking. There was something wrong with his face. His features were soft, blurred somehow, like he didn't quite fit in the real world. I can't describe it better than that. He didn't look right. He didn't say anything. Didn't move. Just stood in the center of the path, staring at us. That's when I ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Branches scratched at my arms and face as I sprinted through the brush, heart threatening to explode. I had no idea if Michael was behind me. I didn't care. I just ran. In what felt like seconds, but could have been minutes, I burst out onto the shoulder and back to the car. Eddie was passed out in the back seat, oblivious. The hazard lights still blinked in the dark. I jumped in, slammed the door, and laid on the horn. I kept pressing it, hoping to draw Michael back, praying he had Daniela with him. Then, finally, after what felt like a lifetime, Michael emerged from the crops, dragging Daniela behind him. She was limp. I leapt out and helped him get her into the car. Her head, he said, breathless, pointing to the side of her face. There was a gash, deep and raw, blood smeared along her temple. It looked like someone had hit her with something heavy. Michael looked pale. Dead sober now. I saw him, he muttered. He was dragging her. I thought she was dead. My mind was reeling. That man, the clearing, the silence. I turned the car on and sped off, heading for the nearest hospital, which was thankfully only about 10 minutes away. The rest of the night was a blur. Doctors rushing Daniela away. Questions from nurses. Forms. Police reports. Eventually, Daniela woke up, but she remembered nothing. Not the party. Not the drive. Not the moment she disappeared into the crops. Just darkness and pain. They never caught the man. Never figured out who he was. He was just there. On someone's land, in the dark, waiting. Maybe for someone drunk. Alone. Vulnerable. Daniela recovered. Physically, at least. But she still doesn't go out at night. Won't even drive past that stretch of highway. Neither will I. Because there are places in this world that look ordinary in the light of day, but become something else entirely after dark. And on Highway 513, something was waiting in the crops. You get used to silence when you work late nights. That thick, still quiet that settles over the world around 1 a.m., when most of the city is asleep, the roads are empty, and every sound feels bigger than it is. You hear your tires on the asphalt, your own breath, the hum of the dashboard lights. That's where I was, driving home alone on a rural highway, sometime after midnight. I had just closed up at the pharmacy where I worked the late shift. It was routine. Clock out, lock the door, get in the car, drive 40 minutes back to my apartment outside of town. That particular night, I remember the clock on the dash glowing 12:17 a.m. Weird the things you remember. The highway was dark, one of those long stretches of road where there are no streetlights, no other cars, just pitch black fields on both sides. I kept my speed around 50, cautious because of deer. I'd seen what could happen when someone hit one going 70. I wasn't eager to join the club. It was on a curve in the road that I saw them, reflective lights on the horizon. At first, I thought it was a construction zone. There were orange cones spaced out, forming a half-circle barrier. And just beyond that, a flashing blue light, the kind that made your brain immediately think police. But something was off. The flashing light wasn't mounted on top of a car. It was sitting on the ground, like a portable warning beacon. I squinted, slowing down as I approached. Then I saw the man. He was standing just past the cones, facing my car, wearing what looked like a reflective safety vest over a dark outfit. He started waving his arms slowly, signaling me to stop. I eased the car to a halt, the tires letting out a faint screech as they met gravel. My heart was racing a little, not out of fear, but confusion. I hadn't done anything wrong, wasn't speeding, wasn't swerving, and there had been no signage about a checkpoint or detour. The man stepped forward. He looked young, mid-20s, maybe. Tall, thin, black, with a bit of stubble and a single earring in his left ear. Under the vest, I could make out a dark blue uniform. He tapped on my window with the joint of his finger, not his knuckle. The gesture was oddly informal, even off-putting. I rolled down the window halfway. "Evening, sir," he said. "License and registration, please." His voice was soft, not unfriendly, but lacking that authoritative edge most cops seem to carry. It was like he was reading lines, not speaking them. I blinked. Did I do something wrong? He hesitated, just for a second. Then he looked to the left, like he was glancing over his shoulder, before returning his eyes to mine. "This is a sobriety checkpoint," he said. "Routine." Something didn't sit right. There were no other cars, no flares, no second officer, No actual police cruiser. Just that little flashing blue light on the pavement and the cones. If this was a checkpoint, where were the rest of the signs? The backup? I swallowed and said, "Why do you need my license and registration if I haven't been tested yet?" Another hesitation. Then, slowly, he leaned back from the window and said, "Step out of the vehicle, sir." There it was, the switch. The moment where your stomach sinks and instinct kicks in, screaming that something is wrong. I stepped out. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't want to escalate anything. Maybe because I was still convincing myself this was just a weird, underfunded operation. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a roll of tape. Walked a few feet ahead and unspooled it in a straight line across the pavement, about 15 feet long. "Walk heel to toe along the tape," he instructed, "arms out to your sides." I did it. Easily. I hadn't had a drop of alcohol. But he followed me too closely. I could hear his breath. I could feel his presence at my back, like he was waiting for something. It made my skin crawl. When I reached the end of the tape, I turned and asked, "Can I see your badge?" He stared at me. Just stared. His eyes didn't blink, didn't twitch. It was like there was nothing behind them. That was the moment I knew. I stepped back once, slowly. "Let me see your ID." He tilted his head slightly, then mumbled something I couldn't catch and turned away, walking toward the dark vehicle parked behind the cones. I hadn't gotten a good look at it before, but now I could see it wasn't a squad car. It was an older sedan. Compact. Civilian plates. The kind of car a high school kid might drive. He opened the driver's side door and leaned inside. That's when I saw it, a handgun in his right hand as he straightened up. I ran. I didn't think, didn't shout, didn't reason. I sprinted back to my car, dove inside, and slammed the lock down just as he started moving toward me. I turned the key, praying the engine wouldn't stall. It roared to life. As I floored it, I caught a glimpse in the mirror. He raised the gun and pointed it directly at my windshield. But I was already flying past the cones, tires kicking up gravel and rubber. No shot. No impact. Just the rapidly vanishing silhouette of a man holding a gun and wearing someone else's uniform. I didn't stop. I stayed on the highway for another 2 miles until I saw an exit sign, one with real streetlights. I pulled off, cut my headlights, and turned down a side road. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely see. I parked in front of a diner, engine still running, and sat there in the dark, trying to breathe. No one would believe me. No badge number. No dash cam. No proof. Just cones, a flashing light, and a man who pretended to be something he wasn't. The next day, I filed a report. Told the local sheriff everything. They didn't find anything. No cones. No sedan. No officer matching the description. They said maybe it was a prank or a one-time impersonator. But the look in their eyes told me they knew better. This kind of thing? It wasn't unheard of. Just rarely survived. To this day, I don't drive that stretch of road at night. I keep my doors locked, my phone recording, and I installed a dash cam, just in case. Because someone out there isn't playing dress up for fun. He's waiting. And next time, someone might not see through the uniform in time. There's something different about being alone in the middle of nowhere at night. Cities don't have that kind of darkness. Cities buzz, glow, pulse. But once you're off the grid, out where the trees grow tall and the stars feel like they're watching, everything changes. I learned that the hard way. It happened just over a year ago, in late October. I was driving cross-country to visit a friend on the other side of the state. The trip was long, and I'd left later than planned. By the time I hit the last stretch of highway, Route 46, a remote two-lane road carved through thick forest, I was already exhausted. But I didn't want to stop. Just one more hour. That's what I kept telling myself. Then the fuel light came on. At first, I thought it was a glitch. I'd filled up just a couple hours earlier. But the needle had dipped dangerously close to empty, and I hadn't seen a gas station in miles. Just dense trees on both sides of the road, their twisted limbs tangled above like skeletal fingers. I sighed, checked my phone for the nearest station. No signal, and kept going. After maybe 10 minutes of quiet panic, the car began to sputter. The engine coughed, stuttered, and then died completely. I coasted to a stop on the shoulder, surrounded by darkness. My headlights were the only light for what felt like 100 miles. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm down. I wasn't totally helpless. I had AAA. I had signal flares in the trunk. I even had a fully charged phone, though still no service. After 10 minutes of trying to call for help, I gave in and hit the Request Roadside Assistance button in the AAA app, praying it would find some kind of satellite connection. Eventually, a loading bar filled. Help on the way. ETA, 90 minutes. Great. I locked the doors, shut off the engine to save power, and leaned my seat back. That's when the noises started. It began as a rhythmic tapping, faint at first, like knuckles on glass. I sat up straight, eyes darting toward the rear windshield, then the windows. Nothing. I turned on the dome light. Still nothing. Probably a twig, I thought, or an animal brushing against the car. But the sound came again, clearer this time. 3 knocks. Precise. Almost deliberate. Knock. 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 I spun around in my seat, squinting through the rear windshield. My breath fogged up the glass. Still nothing. But the unease had begun to bloom. 15 minutes passed. I told myself I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me. Then came the clapping. Not thunder. Not branches. Clapping. From the woods. Slow, steady applause. As if someone were standing just beyond the tree line, mocking me. I shut off the dome light and stared into the darkness, straining to see between the trees. The clapping stopped. Silence returned. And then, I saw it. At first, I thought it was a mask. A pale, round object just visible behind one of the trees. But as I stared harder, I realized it wasn't hanging from a branch or pinned in place. It was peeking, ahead, lifeless, staring, motionless. I couldn't make out the eyes, but I could see just enough. Sunken cheeks, a faint smile frozen in place, and a tilt of the neck that suggested someone, or something, was leaning out from behind the tree. Watching, I fumbled for the flashlight in my glove box, hands shaking. When I looked back up, the head was gone. Vanished. The forest was still again. I turned the flashlight on and swept the beam across the woods, half hoping I'd imagine the whole thing. Then something slammed against the passenger side of the car. I screamed. The door rattled like someone had thrown themselves against it. The window trembled. I dropped the flashlight, lunged across the seat, and peered out. Nothing. Then a second slam, this time against the rear door. And then again, on the roof. I curled into myself, grabbing my keys with trembling hands, hitting the lock button over and over even though the doors were already sealed. I heard footsteps. Soft, crunching leaves, circling the car, and then breathing. Right outside the driver's side window. I turned slowly, terrified of what I'd see. But the glass reflected only my own pale, panicked face. The breathing faded. Then silence again. I sat there in the dark, every muscle locked, staring out into nothing. That's when the flashlight, which had fallen to the floorboard, flickered back on. Its beam lit up the center console. And just for a moment, I saw something in the reflection of the windshield. A hand, pressing against the glass from the outside. And then, a knock. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. My throat was raw the next morning. The next thing I remember was the blinding light of a tow truck pulling up behind me. A man in a yellow safety vest tapped the window with a flashlight. "AAA, you okay?" I unlocked the door, burst out of the car, and nearly collapsed. I looked around frantically, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just wind and forest and the sound of the truck's diesel engine idling. I tried to explain what happened. The man gave me a puzzled look but said nothing. He towed my car to the nearest gas station while I sat in his cab, still shaking. Before he left, he handed me a small card. "I hear things out there sometimes too," he said quietly. "You're not the first." He didn't explain. Just got in the truck and drove off. I've never gone back to that stretch of road. Never drove it again. Not even in daylight. Because I know what I saw. And I know what I felt. There was something in those woods. Something with a face like a mask and a head that didn't move the way it should. And I don't think it was human. I think it was waiting. It was the kind of road you don't notice until you're already halfway down it. One of those forgotten back routes that your GPS only suggests when it thinks you've got no better options. That night, I was heading home from my brother's place, avoiding the interstate because of a construction delay. I was already an hour behind schedule, but I figured the back roads would make up the time. They didn't. Instead, I found myself crawling through unfamiliar terrain, winding curves, dense trees crowding both sides of the narrow two-lane road, and not a single car in sight. Just an endless procession of mile markers and shadows. Then I passed mile marker 134, and my headlights caught a strange glint on the side of the road. A call box. It looked out of place. Old, rusted, painted bright yellow but dulled by time and grime. It stood at the edge of a gravel pull-off like it had been forgotten there in the 1980s. I hadn't seen a call box in years, let alone one so deep in nowhere. I drove past it, slow enough to see the receiver hanging down, swaying slightly like someone had just used it. Weird, but I kept going. A couple minutes later, I passed another one. Same box, same color, same dangling receiver. It was identical. Too identical. I slowed to a crawl, craning my neck to look out the window. Mile marker 134 again. I frowned, checking the odometer. No way. I'd driven at least a few miles. But the marker said 134 again, and the same rusted call box stood there, swaying in the wind. Had I gotten turned around? I didn't think so. The road had been straight, no exits, no splits. I shook off the feeling and kept driving. 5 minutes later, there it was again. Mile marker 134. Same call box. Same gravel pull-off. That's when my stomach dropped. I pulled over, shut the engine off, and got out. The night air was heavy, too quiet. No crickets, no wind. Just the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the gravel. I walked over to the call box. The receiver was still swinging. I reached out and stopped it with my hand. It was warm. That made no sense. It was cold out, low 40s at best. That thing should have felt like ice. I stared at the keypad. Most of the numbers were worn off, but the 0 key was clean, fresh, almost like it had just been replaced. Then the box rang. I jerked my hand back like I'd been burned. The ringing wasn't loud, more like an old-school landline buzz, but in the dead quiet, it was deafening. I stood frozen, staring. Then the receiver swung once, twice. I picked it up. Static. Then a voice, soft, raspy, like it was coming from very far away. Stay off the road. That's all it said. No explanation. No name. Then the line went dead. I stared at the receiver, heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard tires. Headlights appeared behind me. Relief washed over me for a second. Another car, finally, but that turned to confusion quickly. The vehicle didn't slow down. It kept a steady speed and passed by, not even acknowledging my hazards or the fact that I was standing on the side of the road. It was a black SUV. No plates. As it passed, I caught a glimpse of the driver through the window. A man, staring straight ahead. Mouth open. Too open. It wasn't natural. He wasn't blinking. He wasn't moving. I backed up from the road and got back in my car, locking the doors. I sat there for a full minute before deciding to keep moving. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe I was just tired. Either way, I wasn't spending the night next to a haunted phone booth. I kept driving. This time, I watched the odometer closely. 3 miles. 4. 5. Then up ahead. Mile marker 134. And that damn call box. I hit the brakes so hard I nearly fishtailed. Gravel sprayed behind me. I screamed, no one to hear it. Then backed the car up, turned around, and drove the other way. 2 minutes later, the same scene unfolded. Mile marker 134. Same call box. I was stuck. I tried pulling off onto a dirt trail that branched off the main road. Anything to break the loop. It was narrow, winding, barely wide enough for one vehicle, but at least it was different. Trees pressed in from both sides. Branches scraped the roof. Then I saw another car, parked off to the side, tucked under the trees. Engine off. Headlights dark. It was the same black SUV. I stopped. Something inside me screamed to turn back. But my curiosity was louder. I got out. The SUV's windows were tinted, but I could see a silhouette in the front seat. Unmoving. I tapped on the window. No reaction. I went around to the driver's side. Tried the handle. Unlocked. The door creaked open. The man inside was slumped forward. Mouth open. Eyes wide. But not blinking. Not breathing. His hands were clenched around the steering wheel, knuckles pale, white. He looked plastic, like a mannequin. Then I noticed his ear. There was a small metal wire sticking out, running down his neck into his shirt, like he'd been rigged. I stepped back. Branches snapped behind me. I spun around. No one. The woods were still, but I felt it. Something watching me, just beyond the trees. And that's when I heard it again. The ringing. It wasn't coming from the call box. It was coming from inside the SUV. The glove box was vibrating. I hesitated, then opened it. Inside was an old, yellow handset, just like the one on the roadside call box. It was buzzing in my hand. I brought it to my ear. The same voice. Soft. Hollow. You shouldn't have answered. The line cut off. The figure in the seat twitched. I dropped the phone and ran. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, breathing like I'd run a marathon. My car was still there, untouched. I jumped in, slammed the door, and drove. This time, I didn't look at the mile markers. I just drove. I straight ahead. Somehow, I got out. I don't know how. At some point, the road changed. A gas station appeared in the distance like a mirage. I pulled in, got out, and nearly collapsed. I asked the clerk how far I was from mile marker 134. He blinked. "We don't have a 134 out here," he said. "Highest we go is 122. I don't take back roads anymore. Don't trust call boxes. And if you ever see mile marker 134, don't stop. No matter what you see. We're here. Because the call box will ring. And someone will answer. Even if it's not you." I used to love night drives. There was something peaceful about them. The steady hum of the engine, the rhythm of white and yellow lines zipping past, the occasional glow of gas stations in distant towns like islands in the dark. But I don't do them anymore. Not after what happened on Interstate 27. I was driving from Amarillo to Lubbock, Texas. It was late, 1:30 a.m., and I was dead tired. But I had a job interview in the morning, and I figured if I made it to my motel by 3 o'clock, I could get at least 4 hours of sleep. I'd driven that stretch of highway dozens of times. It's not a scenic route, flat plains, occasional oil pumps, some scattered trees, but it's fast and straight. Cruise control territory. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something odd. My GPS blinked. The route line disappeared for a second, then reloaded. I frowned. No service bars. Just a GPS signal lost, warning for half a second, then back to normal. Maybe a tower out, I thought. Or bad reception on a remote stretch. I kept going. That's when I saw the first figure. It stood on the median. A long, narrow island of grass and brush that ran between the north and southbound lanes. I spotted it in my periphery, just a shape, motionless, standing near a rusted mile marker post. I glanced directly at it as I passed. A man, or at least a figure in a long coat, face obscured by shadows. Just watching, not trying to cross, not walking, just standing in the median at 1:40 in the morning. Weird. But hey, maybe someone broke down. Hitchhiker. Homeless guy. Still, it didn't sit right. 10 minutes later, I saw another one. Same figure. Same coat. Same posture. Same spot in the median. Except, this one was standing next to a broken guardrail post. My stomach turned. I looked back in the rearview mirror. No one was there. Okay, nope, I said out loud, as if talking to myself would make it make sense. Maybe I was tired. Maybe my brain was glitching. Long drives can do that. But then I saw the third one. This time, my headlights lit it up more clearly. It wasn't a man. Or at least, not anymore. Its coat wasn't a coat. It was something else, draped, like decaying skin or fabric stretched over bone. Its arms were too long, too still. The face. I looked away before I saw too much. I just kept driving. Faster. I passed a sign for a rest area 2 miles ahead. I decided to stop. Splash water on my face. Shake this off. As I exited the highway, the road curved toward the rest area, a lonely loop with a few vending machines and an overhang. But something was wrong. There were no lights. The lamps in the lot were dark. Even the vending machines were dark. The place looked dead. I almost turned around. But I was desperate for a mental reset. I parked under the main overhang, killed the engine, and sat for a second. Silence. Then movement in the rearview mirror. A shape. Just standing at the edge of the lot, back near the entrance road. I turned to look. Nothing. I told myself it was my imagination. A leftover image burned into my eyes from the last hour. I opened the door, stepped out, and walked to the restroom building. Inside, I flicked the light. Nothing. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight and stepped inside. It was bone cold. The kind of cold that didn't belong in a Texas October. I bent over the sink, splashed my face, and looked up at the mirror. There was something behind me. It stood in the hallway outside the restroom, partially hidden in shadow. I couldn't make out details, but the height, the silhouette, it was one of them. It was standing still, just out of the beam of my phone light. I turned slowly. Gone. Nothing in the hall. I ran. I sprinted back to my car, jumped inside, locked the doors, and peeled out of the lot, tires screeching. Back on the highway, my hands were shaking. I drove faster than I should have, 75, 80, pushing 85. Then I saw it again. The same figure, in the median, except this time. It turned its head, not smoothly, not human, like it was being pulled by invisible strings. It looked directly at me. I stared back, transfixed. My eyes snapped forward just in time to see a deer on the road. I swerved hard, skidded into the opposite lane, barely missed hitting the median, and came to a stop, hard hammering. My headlights now faced sideways, and in the beam, directly across the median. 3 of them, standing side by side. Same figures, same skin-draped forms, same blank, stretched expressions. They weren't moving, but they were closer than before. I floored it. Didn't stop again. Didn't blink. Just kept driving, hoping daylight would come, hoping the road would finally end. I reached Lubbock just before 3 a.m., checked into my motel, slammed the door behind me, slept with the lights on. The next morning, I checked the local news. There'd been a 3-car pileup on I-27 the night before, just before mile marker 210, exact spot I passed. The accident happened around 2 a.m. Fatalities confirmed. They showed a picture of the crash, twisted metal, and in the far background, a blurry shape. In the median, watching. I still wonder what would have happened if I'd stopped longer, if I'd stared too long, if I hadn't swerved in time. Maybe those things are always there, waiting, standing in the spaces we forget, watching the road. And once you see them, they don't forget you either.